we've got Arvind Subramanian with us. Thank you very much, Arvind. You're going to be asked tough questions by Dorab. I'll make things easy for you. I've read your work analyzing the economy right now. You're working hard for once in your life. Actually, you did work quite hard when you produced the economic surveys, I must say. Yes, you did. But first thing is that we are going through a crisis. And I'll just give you some data, and then I'll ask you about your data about the pre-pandemic, how there was a slowdown. But first, just have a look at the current crisis, which some of our viewers might not have seen. We look at overall GDP in the economic survey. It shows that if you compare with 2019, we dropped by about 8%, and we've gone up by about 8.5 to 9%. So but it's because this 8.5 is on a lower base, we're still at 2019 level. And if you look at the normal growth at that time, it could have been 5-6%. So it would have been 12% higher than what it is. So losing 12% in 2 years in GDP growth is a serious crisis. And if we look at manufacturing, it's even worse because that's really taken the brunt of it. If we look at manufacturing, it's worst affected. 2019, it dropped dramatically and has gone up by about 12.5. But manufacturing normally grows a little faster than overall GDP because that includes agriculture. And so if we look at, compared to what it could have been or would have been under normal circumstances, there's about a 23-24% shortfall. Just stick with those two. Agriculture has been more or less fine, so we won't go into that. This is a crisis, and how do we get out of this, Arvind Subramanian?
Yeah, I think in some ways, first of all, to be fair, Prannoy, those kinds of numbers of, having lost 1 or 2 years is not going to be unique to India. Yeah. I mean, the pandemic is it everyone.
No, that's true. No, not unique at all. Yeah.
Yeah. But you could argue that in some ways India has been maybe a little bit more affected than elsewhere. But I think what you showed acquires extra salience because even leading up to the pandemic, the economy was weak. So you see, so that's the magnitude of the challenge that the government and India faces.
We have your graphic. So Arvind, we have your graphic on that. So if you can just run us through it. It's the pre-pandemic slowdown. You compared 2002 to 2011, and then 2011 to 2020. And there was you've shown a tremendously weakening in almost every sector. If we just have a look at all of them, it is quite shocking. Why don't you run us through this?
So essentially, as you know, between the early 2000s, India experienced an unprecedented boom. Across the board, if you take investment, consumption, exports, imports, taxes, asset growth, everything kind of boomed. And the red bars are showing here that they grew in real terms by 10-15% every year. But then what happened after the global financial crisis was, you see, every indicator has slowed down, not by a small amount, but very, very sharply. Take exports in that thing, for example. It went from something like, 15% real every year to 4.5% every year. So, massive thing. So that's the context in which I think we should think about, how the economy will come back. Because
that is the worrying part. That is the worrying part. There was already a slowdown. So given the crisis now, what do we learn from that slowdown and how do we get out of this?
Yeah, I think, the slowdown has had one big scar, which adds to the problem, which I think is worth highlighting before we talk about the solutions, which is that if you look at MNREGA demand, for example, right, it is even today about, 35, 40, 50% more than pre-pandemic levels. So that has, in a sense, left a deep scar in terms of the jobs crisis. We know that job growth was weak even before, but now you've had a massive hit, and therefore, that's why all the indicators of consumption, employment, etc., reflect a very weak labor market and weak incomes for the poorest. So that's what the COVID has done. So now what should we do going forward? That's the big question. And I think that's the question the government and the budget will try and tackle. But I think that before we do that, we must acknowledge 2 or 3, good pieces of news. As we've shown, the government has made big advancements in building physical and digital hardware. I think the delivery of essential goods.
I think you've shown graphs of road building has gone up, railways not as much, but has gone up as well.
Exactly. The digital infrastructure, the UPI, the amount of cash benefits we're doing, that's also improved. And of course, one of the signature achievements of the Modi government, which is, delivering, chula, cooking gas, toilets, bank accounts, housing, etc., what we call new welfareism. I think that's cushioned people for the future. Yeah, the new welfare. Right. And then, of course, in the very recent period, we've had exports which are doing. I think we should acknowledge that. And I think there are 1 or 2 reforms like you've just been discussing, the privatization of Air India, whatever people might say is kind of really a big signature achievement. We tried to do this for a long time. So I think we should acknowledge that. So the question is, what next?
Right.
Now,
may I ask you a question, please?
Yeah, sure. Please.
Is it about time that the idea you floated 2 or 3 years ago of universal basic income, is this the time when there are 85% of people have dropped their income, when 4.5 crore people have moved into extreme poverty? Is that a time to think about UBI? At least for some people, if not total UBI, part UBI.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that what the pandemic and all that's happened, it shows the need for a real safety net for a vast majority of the people. Remember, in bits and pieces in the last 5-10 years, we have created this social safety net. But the problem is that, not everyone benefits. And also, you want want people to be protected against shocks like the pandemic. Right. So it would be a very good time for something like a universal basic income. Now, but here's
one of the things. Sorry, Arvind. Go ahead.
No, see, I think that this is, I think, a very important point when we look ahead. Is Pranay, I think there is a historic opportunity for India today. Historic, and let me tell you what this opportunity is. After the global financial crisis, China became very uncompetitive, especially on a lot of its exports, labor-intensive exports. We calculate, Shoumitro Chatterjee and I, about $150 billion of exports it became uncompetitive in. But we didn't take advantage of that. Vietnam, Bangladesh, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia.
Right.
Now there's a second. Now is the second opportunity, Pranay and Dorabra. What is that second opportunity?
Yes, you're right.
See, no, the second opportunity is that investors are fleeing China for geopolitical reasons. And what we've discovered is that even places like Vietnam, because of the zero COVID policy and things, are not able to meet the space vacated by China. And Vietnam is just not big enough. So there is a second historic opportunity.
An opportunity. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I wanted to go into one more thing. It's a big dilemma, which India. No, just one second, Dura. Sure. There's a very crucial thing that's coming up in the budget. The big dilemma, and it's happening around the world, and it's to do with what should the government do. We've got, should it boost the economy? Should it worry about budget deficits? If you have rising prices now, but you need to boost growth. Inflation currently over the last 6 months is averaging 12%. WPI. That's terrible and is politically damaging. Versus, you've got this problem of a stagnating economy where you already got a budget deficit that's very high. If you try and push and boost the economy, inflation will go up. We've seen this same problem around the world, including America. How do you foresee this big dilemma? How should the government handle this big dilemma?
Yeah, you see, Pranay, my view is very much that, budgets and, spending a bit here, there, a little bit more, a little bit less, is not going to alter fundamentally your growth trajectory, right? That's going to depend on getting exports and private investment going. Government spending can help in the short run. Of course, it can build infrastructure, which can boost long-run growth. And I think that's something that I think the budget should, provide some, a space and spending money for. But more broadly, budgets don't boost growth. I mean, it's all the accompanying policies. And I want to come to, seizing that historic opportunity in a second. So I think the budget
Gaurav,
should
you had a question?
No, let me finish.
Finish and then.
Yeah, I think the budget should very much kind of say, look, firstly, I think it should continue what it did very well last time to come clean on the numbers, all this off balance sheet. It was very good. Continue that.
Right.
Point number one. Point number two is that if there is a bit of a boom, given that our budget deficits and debts are very high, I think it should plan for some, steady consolidation of the debt and deficit going down to signal that, not some drastic thing, but to signal that it's, government believes in prudence, it's taking inflation very seriously, and therefore, kind of signal responsibility on, deficits, debt and inflation. Nothing that you do in the budget is going to make things crazy one way or the other, but just to signal that responsibility, which I think broadly the government has a good record, decent record on being responsible, as it showed even during the crisis. So I think broadly that's what it needs to do. It needs to say, broadly we'll provide some money for capital expenditure. That needs to be done. We're going to be responsible. And if there's any lingering, problems from the labor market, we will give you the social safety net expenditures will be preserved enough for that. That's, I think, those are the kind of modest, but, useful goals that the budget should set for itself. Sorry, now you had questions, Dora.
Yeah.
Dora,
4 years ago, Arvind Panagrija, your namesake, wrote an article in the Economic Times where he said that India's largest company, Reliance Industries, for net investment of $2.2 million, created 5 jobs. Another company called Shahi Exports, which is our country's largest exporter, created for the same amount 1,260 jobs, which is 250 times as many jobs as Reliance Industries for the same amount of investment. Should the budget in some way, because you're talking about people fleeing China and going to Bangladesh and Vietnam, is one of the reasons they're not coming here is the fact that we are not investing in those things, our labor laws, etc., holding people back. I mean, isn't that what will create employment among the semi-skilled workers? We don't have that many skilled workers. It's the semi-skilled and unskilled workers who need employment.
Yeah, so I think that going forward, we need to revive growth and labor-intensive growth. I think we're all agreed on that. We've done very poorly in the past on that. Now, how do we do that? Even if you take, I think, the PLI scheme, for example, most of the incentives are for tech-intensive, capital-intensive, skill-intensive industries. I mean, the labor-intensive industries are not getting very much. But I think what we need to do fundamentally is re-evaluate Atmanirbharta. That, I think, so 2 things. Create an investment climate where investors are going to feel secure that there's a level playing field, there's confidence, there's trust, that once you come in, regulations don't change, some people are not favored more than others. That, fundamental trust in investors, I think, because in the last 5 years, a lot has happened that makes investors, I think. That's why if you look at private investment, for example, it's been completely flat for many, many years. One. Second, I think the government needs to reevaluate the Atmanirbharta policy completely. If you want to export garments, you need the cheapest cost imports. You can't raise tariffs for imports and expect this to be part of this. Second, if you want to export to the dynamic markets, you can't stay away from these trade agreements because you're at a disadvantage relative to something else. Finally, you can't be protectionist. Right. You can't keep raising tariffs, become inefficient. You see, what I think Indians think and the Indian government thinks is that we have a big market and people will come to India for the market. But as we calculated, the Indian consumption market is actually very small compared to the global market. So we have to be internationally competitive, which means cheapest inputs, open economy.
Major rethink.
Yeah, major rethink.
So just, we've got 30 seconds more. Arvind, if you could just tell us, what is the world we are entering into now for the next year? We've seen America is going to raise their interest rates. We are seeing a tightening of money supply all over. Everybody's getting a bit worried about inflation. So are we entering a very difficult phase globally?
Well, I think, as Pranoy, there's a big controversy about whether this inflation is going to be temporary or permanent, and whether the Federal Reserve action can bring it down or not. I think because for example, at the moment, if you look at the latest US GDP numbers, it's like growing gangbusters. It's one of the
record.
So I think for the coming years, I think that will slow down. And people expect, I think, also inflation to come down as a result of that. So I think there will be a little bit of impact on developing countries like India because interest rates will come down. Maybe some capital will flow out of India. But I don't expect major ructions and turmoil in the year ahead because generally, in advanced economies, yes, there is an inflation threat,
right,
but generally they've coped well with it.
Okay. Unfortunately, we run completely out of time, almost 10 o'clock here. Thank you very much. Dorab, I know you had about 1,000 other questions, but we'll save that till
next
tomorrow.
year.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dorab. Thanks, Pranoy. Always great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.